Welcome, everyone. I'm Lisa Ward, the Director of Maddie's Fund's Education Team, and I'll be your host today. If you're like me, you attend a lot of meetings. Here at Maddie's Fund, we learned how to optimize this time with the help of today's guest and his innovative research, and we wanted to share it with you. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. Please take a look at the left side of your screen where you'll see a Q&A window. That's where we'll ask you your questions during the presentation. We'll hold the Q&A until the end, but go ahead and get your questions in early so we can process them in time. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a green file icon. This is your resource widget. Clicking on that will show you links to the presentation handout, which you can download and print. It also has links to the other valuable resources. We'll tell you about them a little bit later. If you need help with your connection during the presentation, you can click on the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. Our speaker today is Dr. Stephen Rogelberg, Chancellor's Professor at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. He is the founder and current director of two large outreach initiatives that focus on animal shelter organization health and effectiveness. He recently won the very prestigious International Humboldt Award for his research and was the first to win the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology Humanitarian Award. He is the editor of the Journal of Business and Psychology and the Talent Management Essentials book series. Dr. Rogelberg's latest book is The Surprising Science of Meetings: How Can You Lead Your Team to Peak Performance?, which was recognized by the Washington Post as the #1 leadership book to watch in for 2019. Dr. Rogelberg, thank you for being here, and we're so excited to listen today.
All right. Well, it is such an honor to be here to talk to you all about a topic near and dear to my heart. Anything to support Maddie's is wonderful. It's just such an incredible organization. So we get to talk about meetings, and what I'll do is I'm going to give you some background information on this crazy topic. I want to share with you some of the science of meetings, because yes, there is a science. And then I want to spend most of the time, though, talking about implications for shelters, and mostly implications for you as a meeting leader. All right, so thank you for that introduction, and as you heard and as you see, I wear a lot of different hats, and the hats I'm most proud of, certainly the work I do with shelters. I'm sure there's many people on the phone that have experienced some of this work through the VIPA program or SEEDS. But the other hat that I'm wearing a lot these days is my hat as a meeting team scientist. And yes, that's actually a thing. I do a lot of research on meetings, and I've been doing it for around 20 years. And what I wanted to do was to take my research, as well as other people's research, and distill it down into this little blue book that's truly designed to change meetings, but to do it in an evidence-based way. And so this workshop this afternoon will focus on the key learnings. All right, so let's kick us off and get you all involved. So here we have our first poll, and what I'd love for you to do is to answer this question: how many meetings per day are there in the U.S. alone? And just kind of click the answer on your screen, and then we'll be able to tabulate results and see how we're doing. So take a few seconds, but everyone jump on in and give your estimate. All right. Let's take a look at your results. Okay, so most people say there are between 1 million to between 1 to 54 million meetings, but quite a few said more than 55 million. All right, let's go to the next poll question. This one is something probably near and dear to your hearts. What percentage of employees complain about having bad meetings? So you got 4 choices. What percentage complain about having bad meetings? Take a few seconds. Answer it. All right. 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Oh, 76 of 100% is definitively the winner. All right. Well, your estimates of both of these things are really quite on target. So here's some data on meetings. There are approximately 55 million of these things a day. Most professionals have around 15 meetings a week, but executives spend 50% or more of their time. 90% admit to daydreaming. 73% acknowledging other work. Too many meetings is the number one time waster. And this last stat to me is the most concerning. Over 70% of senior managers view them as unproductive. Well, that's most concerning because they're the ones who call the most meetings. So when you put this together, tons and tons of meetings, tons and tons of frustration, you could say that we are living and dying in meetings. But I don't see it that way. I see it as an incredible opportunity. As an organizational psychologist, when you have something that's so frequent and yet so frustrating, it's an exciting target to do something about, especially because a world without meetings is much more problematic. Without meetings, cooperation, communication, coordination, consensus decision-making would all suffer. So the elimination of meetings is a false goal. The elimination of bad meetings, that's the true goal. So can research provide some insights to solve this meetings problem? Well, given that I wrote an entire book on it, obviously the answer is yes. There's research that compares standing up meetings to sitting down meetings. And interestingly, they produce the same quality outcomes, but standing up meetings take half as much time. Then there's some research on satisfaction in meetings, because lo and behold, there is someone that tends to leave a meeting feeling pretty good about it. I bet you can guess who that is. It is the meeting leader. And then there's research that looks at silence in meetings. This is really quite interesting. If you have people who come together to brainstorm and you say, hey, you know what? No talking. I want you to write down your ideas or thoughts all on paper. And you collect that and you compare it to a group that did do talking. Well, the silent group produces twice as many ideas, and those ideas are much more creative, right? Because people aren't filtering. They can all talk at once and not be influenced by what everyone else is saying. Well, let me share with you some other work I've done to set the stage. In one of my first studies, I had people keep diaries, and in these diaries, they recorded how much time they spent in meetings and also how they felt about their days at the end of the day. And what we found is that the more meetings someone had, the more drain they reported. But more importantly, the more meetings they had, they felt like they didn't accomplish a lot of work. And this is really concerning, right? Because the hope is that we're having meetings to get stuff done. So the fact that people end their days with that feeling is definitely troublesome. But, and this is a really important but, when the meetings were high quality, it helped lessen the negative effects of having too many meetings. Then I did research on meeting lateness, and around half of meetings start late. And I even conducted an experiment on the topic. And what we found is that when meetings started late, they produced lower quality outcomes, less number of ideas, but we also videotaped the groups, and you actually saw that people engaged more negative behaviors. They tended to be more rude with one another. Basically, when meetings started late, people were angry, and it affected how the group worked together. But one thing just as bad as starting late is, see if anyone can figure out what my picture means, running over. Meetings that run over were a tremendous source of frustration for people. Then I did some research looking at satisfaction with meetings. And this is a bunch of data that were also collected in animal shelters. And we looked at the relationship between people's satisfaction with their meetings and how they felt about their job. And interestingly, people's experiences in meetings in shelters was very predictive of their overall job satisfaction. When they thought that the meetings were being run well, they felt better about their jobs. All right, final study. And maybe this is the most important study. This study looked at employee engagement. And we all know that employee engagement is really important. Employee engagement is related to performance, helping of each other, teamwork, all kinds of key outcomes. So what we had people do was they reported on the types of meeting practices their bosses did, and they also reported on how engaged they were with their jobs in general. Not just the meeting, but their jobs in general. And this was incredible. Those leaders who were more careful with the calling of meetings, meaning that they just didn't call meetings for the sake of it, but they made sure that they had relevant agendas. Those leaders who managed time carefully in meetings, but most importantly, those leaders who created freedom of speech in meetings. They had employees who were more engaged with their jobs. So while we always think of meetings as being places of drain, meetings can also be places of gain. So you put this all together and you say, all right, what's the overall takeaway in 2 words? Well, the overall takeaway is simply meetings matter. Meetings truly matter. Meetings done wrong have tremendous costs for a shelter, including disengagement and even something called meeting recovery syndrome, MRS. And this is the idea that when you have a bad meeting, you just don't shed it at the door. It sticks with you. You take it outside the meeting, you ruminate about it, and you often co-ruminate with others. But meetings done right are major opportunities for shelters, for inclusion, for innovation, for engagement, and success. So now we start to move into practical implications. So the question is, who's responsible for meeting improvement? Now, I can't see you out there, but hopefully everyone's kind of nodding their heads or raising their hands because we all are responsible. And in the spirit of shelters, look, even the dog is admitting that she's responsible for making meetings better. So everyone's responsible for trying to make meetings better. We can always find some meeting that we run, be it in the community, be it the shelter, whatever it happens to be. But also the shelter through its systems. Let me give you a couple examples of organizational things, and then we're going to really focus on things that you can do as a meeting leader. So first of all, shelters need to provide training to people on how to run meetings. This next stat is really one of the most concerning. Despite the fact that there are 55 million meetings a day, around 20% of leaders receive any training on running meetings. This is crazy. How could that possibly be? So leaders don't really know how to do these things, and typically what they do is they just recycle the bad things that they've seen before. So meaningful training. The other thing that shelters can do is change some of their cultural practices. So, for example, some organizations actually require approval to run really large meetings. Sometimes we're lazy. We ask too many people to come to the meetings, and large meetings are incredibly dysfunctional. So we want to make sure that we're sensitive to that, so some organizations think about that. There's also some organizations play with walking meetings, and I love this approach for shelters. So if you have 2 or 3 people, instead of sitting down, take a walk. That's the best time. Get a little exercise, take one of your furry friends with you, and have a meeting while you're walking. Now, there are a couple important notes around this. So first of all, it should be small. 2 or 3 people is fine. You want to tell people in advance you're taking a walking meeting so they can wear the right shoes. You want to make sure that you have a circular route so you wind up where you started. And also, make sure that the walking meeting is appropriate for the topic you want to discuss. If you have a lot of slides, clearly walking meetings not ideal. All right, so those are some organizational practices. Before we turn to leader practices, I want to remind everyone on the line to definitely submit your questions. We're going to be able to talk about questions towards the end, but as you have them, throw them into the chat box, and folks at Maddie's will organize them, and we'll be ready to address them. So please ask questions. We'll definitely have a good 15 to 20 minutes at the end to tackle these issues. And it's particularly important because it's your opportunity to bring up situations that you have at the shelter, and we could talk about them. All right. So we talked about some different cultural practices. I hope that you're particularly excited about the walking meeting, because that's literally made for shelters. But now let's change gears and talk a little bit about things that you can do. All right, I'm going to give you a quick 8. So these are going to be 8 tips that I think are particularly important. My book has tons and tons of tips, but for this presentation, I wanted to focus on these 8. So first of all, number 1 is having a steward mindset. So when a meeting leader recognizes that they are fundamentally a steward of others' time, they lead meetings differently. And remember, if you do call a meeting, you are a steward. And when you're a steward of others' time, well, you just don't dial it in. You make choices. You think. You think carefully about who needs to be there. You think carefully about the topics and that make sure that they require a discussion. But most importantly, you want to honor people's time, so you choose to actively facilitate the meeting. Instead of just featuring your voice, you want to get other people's voices. So you're present. You're mindful. You're calling people out. You're saying, hey, Jane, I haven't heard from you. I'd love to hear your ideas. So that's the most important overarching tip. Embrace your role as a steward, that mindset. Next, keep it as small as possible. While we like to invite others, and certainly we should do that, the larger the meeting is, the more dysfunction there will be, more communication issues, and even something called social loafing. And social loafing is this idea that when people are in a large group, they basically kind of just not work as hard. They multitask. They're not as present. So there's a couple ways we can do this. First of all, and I think this is a great approach for shelters, we could consider inviting people for part of the meeting, but not all of the meeting. So maybe the first part of the meeting is for the larger shelter, but then the second half of the meeting is something more particular for a smaller group of people. Oh, that's a nice way of keeping things lean. Another thing you can do is when you're planning a meeting, think of primary people and secondary people. And instead of inviting the secondary people, shoot them an email. Tell them you're having a meeting and this is what the topic is. Invite them to offer any ideas they have for it, but then promise them that you'll share with them the meeting minutes so that they can stay in the loop and they can come to future meetings if they so choose. But if you give people the opportunity to opt out, they'll take it. But we need to be extra sensitive to this, because one of the things that we find in our research is that when people aren't invited to a meeting, they get kind of worried. They get kind of worried that they're not relevant. So we want to make sure we're sensitive to that. But If you give people an option out, they will take it, and what a gift you're giving them. You're giving them free time, and we all know how much time, how much pressure we have. So if we can give back time, that's a wonderful thing to do. Number 3, don't just default to 1 hour. Interestingly, there's absolutely no good reason that all meetings tend to be an hour. This is ridiculous. This is just because this is the default setting on Google Calendar and Outlook. But that's not a good reason, especially because of something called Parkinson's Law. And Parkinson's Law is this idea that work expands to fill whatever time is allotted to it. So if you schedule a meeting for an hour, magically it will take an hour. Well, let's use that to our advantage. I have a chapter in my book called Meet for 48 Minutes. I don't mean that every meeting should be 48 minutes, but I like the idea of a meeting leader being deliberate, thinking through how much time is needed given a set of goals. But then what I want to do is challenge each of you to actually, once you've decided on amount of time, dial it back a little bit. Create a little extra pressure. What the research shows is that when you create a little extra pressure in meetings, people are actually more focused and they perform better. Number 4, be unconventional at times. If you're having 55 million meetings and each one of them is kind of run the same way, it's boring. So try new things as a meeting leader. Mix it up. Meet in a different place. Have people change their seats. Try silent brainstorming. Have people work in pairs before talking about something as a group. But mix it up. Try to do new things. And what you'll find is, people will appreciate it. Stand up for part of the meeting. What the heck? You have that power. Bring energy. Which also connects with number 5. Start your meetings well. Remember, you're a host. You called the gathering. You are a host. When people arrive, you should thank them sincerely for coming. You should be expressing appreciation and gratitude. When a couple people maybe don't know each other, you introduce them because that's what a host does. Also, and I think this works really well in shelters, occasionally have snacks. One of the best predictors of meeting satisfaction are snacks. Well, it's not the snacks in and of themselves that make people more satisfied with the meeting, but snacks they symbolize caring. They're showing that you're really trying to honor people's time. So think about doing that occasionally. Number 6, leverage alternative meeting formats. Now, this is something I think can work great in shelters. And there's definitely some that are moving to it. This is the idea of break out of conventional meeting practices and play with huddles. So we all know about huddles from sports. These are basically 10-minute meetings, and they have a hard stop at 10 minutes. You can't let these drag on. They can happen every day or every other day, and people just quickly come together in their various departments and get on the same page. What's the biggest challenge? What are some of the key things we need to do today? What's up with certain, furry friends? I mean, you could have these conversations. So huddles are a great way of kind of creating alignment. It's a super meeting approach, and it's very daily based, which is why I like to partner with something called Magic Time. And Magic Time is a time that everyone puts on their calendar, typically every 2 weeks, an hour, where more meaningful substantive issues are discussed. So basically those topics that are kind of bigger, that come up in the huddles, they're parked and then moved to Magic Time to have more deep discussion. All right, so hopefully you might consider playing with huddles. End meetings well. This is something that shelters struggle with. Lots of organizations struggle with too. But your last 5 minutes of your meeting should be conclusion, right? What was decided? Don't let people leave without knowing what was decided, and also who are the directly responsible individuals. We want to make sure that those people are called out and that they act on what was decided or the action items. Number 8. This ties into that blind spot I mentioned earlier, right? We saw that meeting leaders tend to be more positive. And yet from all the frustration, we know that's a misalignment. So good leaders will evaluate meetings periodically. And this could be really simple. They could just do a quick survey of the people in the regularly scheduled meetings. Send something out. What's going well, not so well, what can I do differently? That little survey will give you tremendous ideas on how to be a better meeting leader, and it communicates to everyone that you truly are a steward, right? Because is there anything better a steward can do than ask people for feedback? So that's one practice. And at the very least, if you're not going to do a survey, look around the room. If everyone is on their phone, you're not a very good meeting leader. If everyone's engaged in side conversations, if many people aren't participating, and you're doing most of the talking, well, those are signals of ineffectiveness. So we need to dial into that and be very sensitive to that. All right. So I can't see your face, but does anyone want a bonus? All right. Okay. I think I see some shaking heads. Well, let's talk about agendas. All right. Time for a quick poll. How far in advance do you distribute an agenda? Same day, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, or 5 to 7? Enter your response, and then we'll take a look at the results. All right, enter it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the response, oh my goodness, all over the place. Same day, 1 to 2, 3 to 4. Okay. So the correct answer is really that 1 to 4 days. You want to give people enough time to make sure that they can assess whether the agenda truly is relevant to them. You want to give people enough time to prepare in case there is preparation. So the best practice is you give people a little bit of time, and that's seen as kind of is a way of, again, kind of honoring people. All right, excellent. Let's go to the next one. When in the agenda should you talk about the most important items? Right at the start, in the middle, or towards the end to get everyone warmed up? All right, pick a response on the screen. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Right at the start is the winner by far. And give yourselves a pat on the back or pat a furry friend next to you, because that is absolutely right. Research shows that whatever is discussed at the beginning of the meeting receives the most amount of time and attention. Interestingly, most agendas are actually not structured this way. Most agendas start with long amounts of informational items, and that gets all the time, and then the meaty stuff isn't talked about. So when you create an agenda, my best practice is your first few minutes, well, that can just be a warm-up. That can be, chit-chat and getting folks caught up, but then jump into the most important topic and have at it. And by addressing that most important topic and knowing that you did it well, people are going to leave that meeting feeling much more satisfied. All right, here are some other best practices for agendas. So first of all, ask for input from others. That's really a respectful thing to do. If you're having a meeting, ask folks, hey, are there particular topics you want to be sure that we cover? If some stuff comes up that you aren't going to broach at the meeting, well, you can talk to that individual offline about it. Also consider agenda item owners. As meeting leaders, you don't have to run every single topic. You can actually assign it to others, which is a great way of engaging people. We can sometimes set times for certain agenda items. So perhaps we say this agenda item will only get 5 minutes of time. Well, that's something worth playing with. If you don't want to kind of have your meeting get derailed, you can play with that as an option. And then here's another innovation that I'm really excited about. Instead of, or can do this at times, instead of framing your agenda only as topics, think about framing it as questions to be answered. Right? What are the key questions that we have to answer in this meeting? And by framing it as questions, you have a better sense of who to invite. You have a better sense of when to end the meeting because the questions have been answered. You have a better sense if the meeting is successful because the questions have been answered in a compelling way. And if there are no key questions, well, you just cancel the meeting, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, so there are some tips on agendas. So on your screen, and hopefully you can see it okay, this is just a sample agenda. And this is from somebody, and it's an actual agenda. I'm not saying it's perfect, because it's not perfect, but there's some really cool things about it. I like that the person did not default just to an hour. I like that they went for 50 minutes. I think that's great. I like that item 1, they have a time limit so it doesn't get out of hand. And you could see, in this case, Sam and LaToya broached some topic for them, so they wanted to make sure they cover it. I like that with items 2 and 3, they have a process note. They say how they're going to run it, and they also are very clear how to prepare for it. So anyways, I wanted to share this with you. I know you'll be able to get all these materials downloaded because I just thought there were some neat features to this agenda, things to consider for the future. All right, time for another poll. How do you deal with the situation that just a couple of people are dominating the conversation and there's a lack of engagement by others? Do you tell the heavy talkers to shut up, or do you look at the next slide? All right, give it a go. 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, look at the next slide. A reasonable response, given that there is a next slide. So, what are some ways of creating more balanced engagement across a meeting? Okay, there are a host of options. So all of these options, I think, I call them unconventional, but they're only unconventional because people don't do them a lot. I don't believe you should do these all the time because then they'd start to get boring. But my best path for getting certain people to not dominate is to try to elevate others. Basically, if others are heavily engaged, those dominators have less airtime to take. So how do we get people engaged? Well, this is something we talked about a little bit earlier. If you have some shy people, but they're really important, well, let them own some agenda items. Let them really, tackle them, bring them up, facilitate discussion. So that's a great way of getting them involved. And by the way, you can also provide them some feedback on how they did. They'll probably appreciate that. Speak to folks before the meeting. So one of the best ways of getting people talking at a meeting is to tell them before the meeting that, hey, I'd love to hear from you on this particular topic. When you do that, they're going to be much more willing to contribute. In fact, you could even use this technique to quiet others. So you could go to someone, you could say, hey, Bob, I know you have a lot of opinions on this. I want to make sure we hear from other people. Could I ask you to, let's make sure, help me get everyone's voices out there. And then Bob will kind of embrace this other role. Dyadic work. This works wonders. If you're talking about, let's say, an important issue at the shelter, it could be a sanitation issue, an adoption issue. You have people, gather around and you say, you know what, here's our challenge. I want everyone to work in pairs and to talk about this for, let's say, 3 minutes, and then we'll come together and talk. what will happen is that those pairs will explode with conversation. And when you come back as a group, people are going to be wanting to report out what they came up with. And one of the neat magical things that happens is that if there's a shy person in a pair, well, they start to get represented by someone else. So a host of ideas will emerge. 4, I'm a really big fan of, if you want to get lots of ideas, well, maybe administer a quick survey monkey before the meeting, asking people for their thoughts, and then just report it at the meeting and let the conversation occur. Interestingly, there's free apps out there that'll let people vote in real time on particular options. So if you want to know if you really have consensus, well, have people use their phones and vote on various options. And they'll do this blind of where other people are. But you'll know truth. And that's really what we want as a meeting leader. I'm also keen on role-playing. I think that could be fun in meetings. We do this with this idea of devil's advocate, but we can do other things. We could actually have someone role-play being a customer, role-play, being someone who's really positive. So if you find that your group just tends to be so negative, well, someone can role-play finding things that are right about things. So you could be creative, and periodically you can roll these out, and it's just another way of helping to engage people. So none of these things are magic solutions, but each of these just give you more tools. And that's really what we want to make meetings work. And that's what steward leaders care about. Steward leaders will say, hey, I want to pick the right tool for the job. All right. Well, what's a presentation without talking about Amazon? So I want to just tell you an interesting technique that Amazon does as a way of getting engagement. So people are so busy that often they don't prepare in advance for the meeting. So what Amazon often does is they'll take the first 10 minutes of the meeting and they'll actually have people read the preparatory materials in the meeting itself. They don't expect them to come to the meeting prepared. Well, this is pretty interesting. So for the first 10 minutes, people are just reading all together in silence. But then after 10 minutes, as a meeting leader, you know everyone's on the same page. Everyone's read the material. Everyone's ready to go. Because the problem often is that when people are not prepared, they don't admit it, and they often fake it. So the conversation in the meetings might not be so great. All right. So let's put this all together. I am excited about meetings. And the perspective I took in my book and the perspective I took here is that meetings can do great things for organizations, but they're clearly not working very well now. But if we can make even just 20% of our meetings 20% better, well, that's going to be an incredible gain for shelters. And people in shelters don't have time to waste. So investing in your meetings is a great way of elevating the shelter so that you can act and spend more time delivering on your critical missions. And while we can't control other people's meetings, we can control our meetings. We can do our meetings better, right? We can be the light. We can be the example. And I'll give you a quick little example. Research shows that 50% of all agendas to meetings are recycled. That's ridiculous. We should never do that. We want to make sure that our agendas are interesting and intriguing and thoughtful. So be the light. You have control over what you do. All right, so I know that there's going to be tons of resource pages available, but you'll see my website there, and you are very welcome to visit. There's more resources there, more information on the book, some of the media stuff that I've done, so lots of different things that you can access. But before we turn to questions, I actually want to challenge you for 30 seconds. on your phone or on a piece of paper, I actually want you to do this exercise. Research has shown that when people in a training experience do this exercise, they wind up much more likely to make positive changes. So, honor this exercise. Give it a go. For 30 seconds, I want you to write down privately, not to share, privately, what will you do differently given this session? What will you try to do as it relates to leading teams and meetings? All right, so take 30 seconds and give it a go. Everyone do it. Have about 20 more seconds. 10 more seconds. Everyone has to write down at least one thing that they'll do differently. Awesome. Thank you. All right. So you can see lots of resources that will be available to you for you to check out so you can learn more about meetings, including my crazy interview on CBS this morning about my book and meeting science. I hope you'll enjoy that. It's been really fun to see kind of the reaction to the books. And all of this you can find in this widget, the green widget at the bottom of your screen, so you'll be able to access it all. All right. Well, now it's time for your questions. So I am going to stop and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
All right. Thank you so much. That was amazing. It's now time to move on to some questions from our audience. So let's look at our first question. Can you talk more about managing challenging people in meetings? Overtakers, undertalkers, etc.
Sure. So, first of all, sometimes these people don't realize how difficult they are. It could be a blind spot for them. So if you see this recurring behavior, it's something that you can talk to them offline about. You can say, hey, I'm running this meeting. I really want to make sure this works for everyone. Can you help me kind of get these others involved? I find that, after you speak a lot, people tend to kind of quiet down. I don't think that's helpful. So basically you kind of have a conversation offline to make them aware. But then the second approach is to take more of the positive approach that help give others more agency. So if you think about the various techniques that I shared, if you use those techniques, well, others' voices are going to get elevated, and I think they'll start to push out those other people. So I think that 1-2 approach is a great way of handling it. I also want to add that when you collect feedback from folks, so if you do that little survey, what might come out of that survey are people saying, hey, we have a couple people who are dominating. Well, now you can leverage that feedback and share that with people. Say, hey, you're going to try to do things differently because, you want to make sure that this is a good experience for everyone. So sometimes that feedback is not only good for you, but you can leverage it to change the culture of a meeting. Great question.
Great. Thank you. Our next question. Our monthly board meetings are currently open to the public. Do you have any info on how people coming in to watch the meeting has any effect on the meeting?
Oh, yeah. I don't like that at all. I want to understand why that's the case. Absolutely. Having observers can clearly change the dynamics of the meeting. It could lead to people posturing, performing, all kinds of concerning outcomes. So I wouldn't be keen on that practice. If it has to be the case that you have to have these observers, maybe they're there for part of it, but then I'd go into executive session where that wouldn't be public, where the real work will get done. That would be, I think, the best way of approaching it.
Great. Thank you. Our next question. We have people at different locations, so some of these ideas are difficult. We try to get the team leaders together every 2 months to see each other face to face, but we tend to run the meetings for a couple of hours since we don't meet so often. We do serve food or snacks. Any suggestions for this situation?
So I like the fact that they're trying, to get people together, and because I think there's certainly value to that. That, to me, is the absolute perfect situation to send out a survey to people saying, how can we make these 2 hours really valuable for everybody? I think you basically have to plan those 2-hour meetings like you're planning a retreat or a workshop. That you have to be thoughtful, you have to be creative, and you have to really mix it up. And there's nothing wrong with getting people into subgroups at times to work together, telling people, hey, we're rotating, moving people around. But basically you want to design that 2 hours as an engaging experience. And each of these 2-hour meetings really should look different. There might be a couple things that are the same, but they should be different. So I'd gather feedback from folks, see what emerges. I typically would have, at least a few people kind of planning these meetings, and they're charged of, mixing it up. But, so while the intent of getting everyone together for 2 hours is such a good one, if it's not an engaging experience, then people are going to resent it. So be thoughtful, and really own making these meetings great. But share ownership by collecting feedback.
Thank you. Next question. If a person wants to run a meeting, how do you schedule such a meeting? For example, if a manager has an issue, do you get the idea from them, give them a time to talk, or run the meeting?
Can you read it one more time? I want to make sure I understand it.
Sure. If a person wants to run the meeting, how do you schedule such a meeting? For example, if a manager has an issue, do you get the idea from them, give them a time to talk, or just have them run a meeting?
So if I understand correctly, there's a lot of different ways, of scheduling these meetings. Leaders could make sure that they have short meetings with all of their folks that report into them on a regular basis. We actually have data that suggests that when leaders have regular one-on-one meetings with the people that report into them, that it's optimal for effectiveness. And when they're predictable like that, it can be really helpful. So I'm a big fan of that, and these meetings could be just 15 or 20 minutes long. They can have kind of a standard structure to them where you kind of cover, hey, how are we doing on, say, key outcomes, what are your biggest challenges? But I really love that approach, so that in that case, if someone had an issue, well, they know that they have an upcoming meeting with their supervisor. So that is definitely a good way of doing it. I know other leaders that actually every week they block off an hour or two on their calendar that's just, they call it, like basically office hours, where everyone knows that they can stop by. They're going to make sure that leader commits to being available at that time, and that can be really comforting for folks. So you're not tracking that person down. You know they're going to be in a particular place. So those are a couple ideas for kind of addressing the scheduling. I'd also say that, this kind of comes back to some of the huddle stuff. Huddles can be very predictable times, and that's a good opportunity where you could just grab someone after a huddle and say, hey, can I chat with you? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. What advice do you have for those of us who are leading meetings and are a mid-level role in a room full of high-level management or executives? How do I lead a meeting with authority when I don't really have any?
Well, I think you do have more authority than you think if you're planful. So if it's clear that you've designed a meeting and it's going to be interesting and exciting, people are going to defer to you. And so I think to the extent that you yourself believe as meeting leader that you do have authority, I think people respect it. If you don't have that belief, that's going to affect how you behave. You will act differently, you will act timidly, and the senior leaders will, slurp up that time and take it away from you. But I think what you're describing is a cool opportunity. Like if you're in a meeting and you've got all your bosses there and you shine, like that looks great for you. And what's really interesting is that making meetings better is not just good for those around you. It's not just good for the organization, but it's also good for you personally in terms of your advancement in an organization. As you get promoted in an organization, sometimes we get promotions because we have these special skills. But as we move up, we become responsible for more and more people's time, and we need to work with and through others. So to the extent that we develop our meeting leadership skills, our likelihood of derailing is much, much lower. Very cool question.
Great. Thank you. Can you talk a little more about magic time and how that works?
Sure. So I think it does tend to work best in combination with the huddles concept. So really the huddles idea, you have to keep them short. They have to be very short. Right. In football, it's 30 seconds. In business, we have to make sure it doesn't break 10 minutes. It's a quick alignment. People come together, really focused on the day, maybe the week, but it's quick, fast, heavy, quick hitting. And then it's clear, though, in doing these things that substantive issues will emerge, and that's what you park and move to the magic time. So the magic time is this predictable time on everyone's calendar. Everyone has agreed, for example, to leave Mondays at 10 a.m. open. And everyone leaves it open. No one puts anything in there. So everyone knows that time is available. And if there are some key issues, more strategic issues that have to be discussed, that's where they happen. And if the leader can't think of any strategic issues or nothing emerges, well, that time is canceled. And people get it. And they can use magic time any way that they want. But ultimately, and this is something I think is really important for shelters, shelters often get very caught up in the day-to-day, and they don't think about the longer-term strategic issues. So I feel like with this approach, the huddles are about the day-to-day, but the magic time can be much more about the strategic stuff that's also important for shelters to do.
Wow, I love that concept of magic time. That's great. How can these tips apply to remote workers / meetings?
So running remote meetings is definitely very challenging. Everything we've talked about is completely relevant to running remote meetings, but the leader has even greater responsibility when it's a remote meeting. That leader has to truly embrace her or his role as a facilitator, as an air traffic controller. They need to insist that people attend the meeting via video because we want to create presence. They need to be calling on people. They need to say, hey, Sheila, I haven't heard from you. What are your thoughts? And they need to be right, active, in the face, keeping tallies in a sense on their private remarks, and drawing people out. So that really active effort. They also need to even be more careful with the agenda. Make sure that the agenda really fits this virtual approach. I have in my book, I talk about this idea of banning the mute button, and this got all kinds of crazy press response. So I don't mean the mute button should always be banned, but I actually think there's something important about that idea. Right? If you ban the mute button, then people have to be in a quiet place to have a meeting. Right? They have to be not eating their lunch. They have to be very present. They can't be at the doctor's office. And, this is an okay thing. If you're calling the meeting and everyone's there in person, you would expect them to kind of be present. But with virtual attendees, we often don't have that same bar. So we want to do everything we can to keep people present. I think virtual meetings need to be shorter. They need to be tighter. And that leader really has to own that they are an air traffic controller.
Great. Thank you. Next question up. How do you manage interdepartmental conflict in meetings? In the shelter world, people can be very protective of their area and can easily derail a meeting.
Yes. So first of all, we should know that conflict in meetings is actually not necessarily a bad thing. That often greatness happens when there's conflict. And what we want to move to is a system where conflict is resolved constructively and not personally. So I love the idea of departments, batting around ideas and sharing it from their just different perspectives. So I encourage a meeting leader to allow that to happen. But what the meeting leader can be really dialed into is making sure that those conversations stay constructive. And that can be done. Basically there are certain, you can have rules of engagement, of how people have conversations, right? Some meeting leaders say, hey, let's establish some good norms. So those could be kind of communicated to kind of lay the groundwork. Again, sometimes some of this stuff can be nipped in the bud by having pre-meeting conversations, where people are encouraged, hey, we want your different ideas, but let's make sure that this stays constructive. But I think the main thing is, a leader coming forward and saying, yeah, we've got different departments here with different ideas. Let's get those ideas out there because that's everyone's truth. And let's have a good, robust conversation around it that doesn't get personal. And I think kind of communicating that as a norm, I think can change a lot of the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. We have so many amazing questions out there still, and we will get to those offline. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Rogelberg, and thanks to all of you in the audience for sharing your time with us. We invite our viewers to join an online discussion about this and other webcasts on Maddie's Pet Forum. Find the link to our forum in the green resource widget at the bottom of your screen. Watch for announcements of upcoming webcasts and find more free educational opportunities on our website at maddiesfund.org and on Maddie's University at maddiesuniversity.org. Again, thank you, Dr. Rogelberg. This was amazing, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.